The thunderous sound of a gunshot echoed through Clearwater Gulch as Cordelia Bennett stood frozen in the pouring rain, the freshly dug grave of her third husband at her feet, a sea of judgmental faces surrounding her. The year was 1875, and in this small frontier town nestled in the Colorado Territory, folks were quick to whisper about how every man who married Cordelia met an untimely end. Cursed, the townsfolk whispered as they dispersed, leaving her alone in the downpour. That woman is death to any man who takes her hand. Cordelia felt the weight of their stares and words pressing down on her shoulders, heavier than the sodden black mourning dress clinging to her slender frame. At 25, she had buried 3 husbands, one to fever, one to a mining accident, and now Thomas, shot down in a saloon brawl that had nothing to do with her. But facts meant little in a town hungry for gossip and explanation. As the last of the funeral goers disappeared down the muddy path toward town, Cordelia remained, her golden brown hair darkened by rain, face lifted to the sky. She had no more tears left to shed. Only the hollow feeling of knowing she was now completely alone in a world that had decided she was cursed. Miss Bennett. The deep voice startled her. She hadn't heard anyone approach through the storm. Turning, she found herself face to face with Mason Wade, tall and imposing under the brim of his well-worn Stetson. He was one of the few men in Clearwater Gulch. She hardly knew a quiet cattle rancher who kept to himself, only coming to town for supplies or the occasional drink at the Frontier Saloon. "Mr. Wade," she acknowledged, her voice barely audible above the rain. He stood a respectful distance away, but extended a weathered hand toward her. "You shouldn't be alone out here. Let me see you home." Cordelia stared at his outstretched hand. "You know what they say about me." "I don't much care for gossip," he replied simply. His eyes, clear and blue as a summer sky, held no judgment. "Just offering a kindness in a storm." She hesitated. Taking a man's hand, even in simple courtesy, felt dangerous now, but there was something in Mason Wade's steady gaze that made her reach out, placing her trembling fingers in his palm. His grip was firm and warm despite the cold rain. As they walked down the hill away from the cemetery, Cordelia was keenly aware that this was the first human touch she'd felt since the whispers of curse began following her through town like a shadow. Neither spoke as they made their way to her small house at the edge of town. Only when they reached her porch did Mason release her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Wade," she said, fumbling with the key to her door. "Mason," he corrected gently. Then, after a pause, "I'm sorry about your husband." The simple sincerity in those words nearly broke her composure. Cordelia nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. "If you need anything." He didn't finish the sentence, just touched the brim of his hat in farewell and turned to go. "They're saying I'm cursed," she blurted out, surprising herself with the admission. "That any man who—" She couldn't continue. Mason stopped and looked back at her, rain streaming down his face. "Folks need reasons for the things they can't explain, makes them feel safer." His expression softened. "But I've never put much stock in curses, Miss Bennett." With that, he strode back into the downpour, becoming a shadow in the gray curtain of rain. Cordelia watched until he disappeared, then entered her empty house, the lingering warmth of his hand around hers the only comfort in a world grown cold and hostile. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the storm having washed away the oppressive heat that had blanketed Clearwater Gulch for weeks. Cordelia moved through her morning routine mechanically, dressing in her black morning clothes out of necessity rather than custom. She had no illusions about her feelings for Thomas. Their marriage had been one of convenience, an arrangement that offered her protection after her second husband's death left her vulnerable and alone. Still, she had respected Thomas, and his death had been shocking and violent. A drunken argument over a card game, a pistol drawn too quickly, and another husband in the ground. Another reason for the town to whisper. Cordelia knew she needed supplies. The pantry was nearly bare, and hiding away would only fuel the gossip. With squared shoulders and her chin held high, she left her house and walked toward the general store, feeling eyes tracking her progress from behind curtains and through shop windows. Mrs. Peterson, the minister's wife, crossed the street to avoid passing her. Two men stopped their conversation abruptly as she approached. Cordelia kept her eyes forward, pretending not to notice. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully as she entered Harmon's general store, a jarring contrast to the immediate hush that fell over the customers inside. Mr. Harmon himself stood behind the counter, a strained smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Bennett, he greeted her, the formal address awkward on his tongue. He'd known her since she was a girl, had even attended her first wedding 10 years ago. Good morning, Mr. Harmon. I need flour, sugar, and coffee, please. Her voice sounded stiff and unnatural to her own ears. As he gathered her items, she felt the stares burning into her back. A mother pulled her young daughter closer as Cordelia passed by. The little girl looked up, wide-eyed. Mama says you're bad luck, the child said innocently before her horrified mother shushed her. Cordelia pretended not to hear, but her hands trembled as she counted out coins for her purchases. That'll be all, Mrs. Bennett? Mr. Harmon asked, not quite meeting her eyes. Yes, thank. The door swung open with force, the bell clanging wildly as Mason Wade strode in. His tall frame seemed to fill the small store, and Cordelia noticed how the other customers straightened slightly in his presence. Unlike many of the rough men who populated the area, Mason carried himself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. He nodded to the room generally, then tipped his hat specifically to Cordelia. Mrs. Bennett, he acknowledged her openly, his voice carrying enough for everyone to hear. A murmur rippled through the store. Cordelia felt her cheeks warm. Mr. Wade, she returned politely. He stepped up to the counter beside her, seemingly oblivious to the stares. Need a few things for the ranch, he told Harmon, and I'll carry Mrs. Bennett's packages for her if she'll allow it. Before she could protest, Mason had gathered her flour and other supplies in his arms alongside his own purchases. I'm headed your direction anyway, he said, though Cordelia knew perfectly well his ranch lay in the opposite direction from her home. Outside the store, she finally found her voice. You didn't have to do that. Do what? There was the faintest hint of amusement in his tone. Make a show of speaking to me, carrying my things. People will talk. Mason shrugged his broad shoulders. People always talk, doesn't make what they say worth listening to. They walked in silence for a moment before he spoke again. I lost my wife 6 years ago. Childbirth. His voice was matter of fact, but Cordelia caught the undertone of old pain. Some folks said it was because I'd married a woman from back east who wasn't built for frontier life. Others blamed the midwife. People need something to blame when bad things happen. Cordelia glanced at him, surprised by the personal revelation. I'm sorry about your wife. He nodded once. My point is, I know something about being on the receiving end of whispers. It passes eventually. 3 husbands is different, she said quietly. That's not normal bad luck, that's... She trailed off. That's life in a dangerous place, Mason finished firmly. Men die out here all the time. Mining accidents, bar fights, disease, Indians, bad weather. He looked down at her. You've had more than your share of grief, Mrs. Bennett, but that doesn't make you cursed. They had reached her house. Mason set her packages on the porch and stepped back, maintaining a respectful distance. Thank you, she said, meaning it for more than just carrying her supplies. I have a mare that foaled last week, he said abruptly. Pretty little filly, thought you might like to see her sometime. The invitation surprised her. I haven't been on a horse in years. You don't have to ride, just thought you might enjoy the sight of new life. He touched his hat brim. Think about it. I'm at the Double W, about 5 miles west of town. With that, he turned and walked away, his long strides carrying him quickly down the dusty road. Cordelia watched him go, puzzled by the man who seemed determined to ignore the warnings that kept everyone else at a safe distance. 3 days later, Cordelia found herself at a crossroads both literally and figuratively. She stood at the fork in the road where the path to town split from the trail that would lead west toward Mason Wade's ranch. She had told herself she was just taking a walk to clear her head, but her feet had carried her farther than usual. The invitation to see the new foal still lingered in her mind. It had been so long since anyone had invited her anywhere. Since Thomas's death 2 weeks ago, she had been effectively shunned by the community that had once embraced her. Even her childhood friend, Sarah, who ran the town's small dressmaking shop, had been coolly distant when Cordelia stopped by. The isolation was wearing on her. Each day alone in her house felt like another stone added to the wall that separated her from normal life. With a decisive breath, she turned west. The walk was longer than she had anticipated. By the time the weathered sign for the Double W Ranch came into view, the afternoon sun was high, and perspiration dampened her collar despite the relatively mild day. She hesitated at the gate, suddenly unsure of herself. What if Mason had just been making conversation? What if he regretted extending the invitation? Before she could turn back, a ranch hand spotted her and called out. "Can I help you, madam?" I'm here to see Mr. Wade," she said, embarrassed by how uncertain she sounded. The young man, little more than a boy, really nodded and pointed toward a large barn. "He's in there with the new foal. Said to expect you might come by." Cordelia's surprise must have shown on her face because the young ranch hand grinned. "Mr. Wade said a lady might come to see the filly. Said to keep an eye out and make you welcome." Thanking him, she made her way to the barn, her confidence slightly bolstered. At least she wasn't entirely unexpected. The interior of the barn was cool and dim after the bright sunlight. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust, but then she saw Mason kneeling beside a chestnut mare, his back to the door as he examined one of the horse's legs. "Easy, girl," he murmured to the animal. "Just checking you over." Cordelia cleared her throat softly, not wanting to startle either man or beast. Mason turned, and the smile that spread across his face at the sight of her was genuine and warm. "Mrs. Bennett, you came?" "I hope it's not an inconvenience," she said. "Not at all." He stood, brushing hay from his trousers. "I'm glad you decided to visit. Come meet Maple and her filly." Cordelia approached cautiously. It had indeed been years since she'd been this close to horses. Her first husband had kept a team for his wagon, but after his death, she'd sold them along with most of their possessions. The mare eyed her warily but remained calm. Beside her stood the foal, all spindly legs and curiosity. "She's beautiful," Cordelia breathed, genuinely enchanted by the sight. The filly was chestnut like her mother, but with a perfect white star on her forehead. "She is," Mason agreed, his gaze shifting between the horses and Cordelia. "Would you like to touch her?" Cordelia hesitated, then nodded. Under Mason's guidance, she slowly extended her hand, letting the filly sniff her before gently stroking the velvety muzzle. The contact was magical warm life beneath her fingertips, innocent and trusting. "I've been calling her Star for obvious reasons," Mason said, "but I haven't settled on it." "Open to suggestions." "Star suits her," Cordelia said, smiling as the filly nudged her hand, looking for treats. "She likes you." There was something in Mason's voice that made Cordelia look up at him. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Interest, certainly, but something else too. Something warmer. She withdrew her hand from the foal, suddenly self-conscious. "Thank you for showing her to me. It's been a long time since I've seen something so new and hopeful." Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Would you like to see the rest of the ranch? I could show you around, maybe offer you some coffee before you head back to town." The invitation was casual, yet Cordelia sensed a certain deliberateness behind it. Mason Wade was extending more than mere hospitality. He was offering friendship, perhaps the only friendship available to her in a community that had labeled her dangerous. "I'd like that," she said simply. The tour revealed a prosperous, well-managed operation. Mason had clearly worked hard to build the Double W into something substantial. The main house was modest but solid, with a wide porch that caught the afternoon breeze. Inside, the furnishings were simple but of good quality. "My foreman's wife comes in twice a week to keep things tidy," Mason explained as he showed her to the kitchen. "I'm afraid I'm not much of a housekeeper myself." But the kitchen was clean and organized, and Mason moved around it with ease, preparing coffee with practiced motions. Cordelia sat at the sturdy oak table, watching him work. "How long have you had this ranch?" she asked. "Going on 8 years now. Started small, just me and a handful of cattle, built it up bit by bit." Pride touched his voice. "It's good land, generous if you treat it right." Cordelia thought of her own small house in town, how empty it felt despite its modest size. It must be satisfying, creating something like this. Mason placed a cup of coffee before her. "It is, though sometimes lonely." He sat across from her with his own cup. "My wife Caroline and I had big dreams for this place. Family dreams." A shadow crossed his face. "After she died, I nearly sold it all and moved on, but in the end, I couldn't let go of what we'd started." The personal admission touched Cordelia. "I understand," she said softly. "After my first husband died, I felt adrift, like I'd lost my place in the world." "Is that why you remarried?" The question was direct but not unkind. Cordelia stared into her coffee. "Partly. James, my first husband, he was the only one I married for love. He was kind and had such plans for us." She sighed. "After the fever took him, I was 20 and alone. My parents were both gone. When Henry proposed 6 months later, it seemed like the sensible choice. He was older, established in the mining business." "And Thomas?" Mason asked quietly. "After Henry died in the mine collapse, the gossip started. Not like now, but there were whispers. Thomas offered protection, a name. It wasn't." She struggled to find the right words. "It wasn't a love match, but we respected each other. He was a good man in his way." Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Life out here forces practical decisions sometimes." They talked for over an hour, the conversation flowing easily between them. Mason told her about growing up in Missouri, his journey west after the war, meeting Caroline in Denver. Cordelia shared stories of her childhood in a small Ohio town, how she'd come west with her parents as a girl, only to lose them both to influenza within a year of arriving. When she finally rose to leave, the sun was beginning to lower in the sky. "I should get back before dark," she said reluctantly. "I'll saddle a horse and ride with you," Mason insisted. "It's too far to walk back now." Though she protested that she didn't want to be a bother, Cordelia was secretly relieved. The prospect of the long walk home had been daunting. Mason saddled 2 horses, helping her mount a gentle bay mare. "Her name's Daisy. She's steady as they come." The ride back to town was pleasant, with Mason pointing out features of the landscape and sharing stories about the area. As they approached Clearwater Gulch, however, Cordelia grew tense, anticipating the stares and whispers that would greet her return, especially in the company of Mason Wade. "Perhaps you should let me continue alone from here," she suggested as they reached the outskirts of town. Mason frowned. "Why would I do that? People will talk about you being seen with me." His expression hardened slightly. "Let them." They rode side by side down the main street, and just as Cordelia had feared, heads turned, conversations stopped. Eyes followed their progress. She kept her gaze forward, chin high, though her stomach churned with anxiety. When they reached her house, Mason dismounted first, then helped her down from Daisy. His hands were strong and sure at her waist, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for coming to see the filly," he said, "and for the company this afternoon. Thank you for showing me your ranch. It's lovely." She hesitated, then added, "And thank you for not being afraid to be seen with me." Something flashed in Mason's eyes, determination, perhaps. "I'm not a superstitious man, Mrs. Bennett. I judge people by their actions and character, not by rumors." "Cordelia," she said impulsively. "Please call me Cordelia." His smile was warm. "Cordelia, then." He touched the brim of his hat in farewell. "I hope you'll visit the ranch again." Star would like to see you, I'm sure." She watched him ride away, aware of curtains twitching in neighboring houses. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Cordelia found she didn't much care what the townsfolk thought. Over the next few weeks, a cautious friendship developed between Cordelia and Mason. He began finding reasons to come into town more frequently, often stopping by her house with small gifts, fresh eggs from his hens, a jar of honey from a wild hive his ranch hands had found, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. Each visit caused a fresh wave of gossip throughout Clearwater Gulch. Some were scandalized that Mason would court disaster by associating with the cursed widow. Others speculated that he was merely being charitable to a woman ostracized by society. A few whispered that there must have been something between them before Thomas's death. Cordelia heard the rumors, but found them easier to ignore with each passing day. Mason's friendship had given her something she'd lost hope that life might still hold some measure of happiness. One crisp October morning, Cordelia was tending the small herb garden behind her house when she heard the now familiar sound of Mason's horse approaching. Rising, she brushed dirt from her hands and smoothed her hair, surprised by her own eagerness to see him. He appeared around the corner of the house, leading his horse rather than riding. In his free hand, he carried a small wooden crate. "Good morning," he called, his smile brightening his weathered face. "Good morning," she returned, suddenly conscious of her work-worn appearance. "I wasn't expecting you today. I had business in town," he explained, tying his horse to her fence post. "And I brought you something." He held out the crate. Inside were 6 glass jars of preserved peaches, the fruit golden and perfect behind the glass. "My foreman's wife put these up last month. Thought you might enjoy them." "They're beautiful," Cordelia said, genuinely touched by the thoughtful gift. "Thank you, Mason." "There's something else," he said, suddenly looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "There's a harvest dance in Morgan Creek next Saturday. It's about 10 miles from here, so folks there don't know much about Clearwater Gulch gossip." He paused, then continued with determination. "I'd be honored if you'd accompany me." Cordelia stared at him, caught completely off guard. A social event in public as his companion. It had been so long since she'd done anything of the sort. Fear and longing warred within her. "I don't know if that's wise," she said softly, "because of what people might say." "Because I don't want to bring you harm," she admitted, voicing the fear that had been growing as their friendship deepened. "What if they're right? What if I am cursed? 3 husbands, Mason, all dead before their time." His expression softened and he stepped closer, taking her dirt-smudged hands in his. "Cordelia, listen to me. There is no curse. There's just life unpredictable and sometimes cruel. I've lived through war and wilderness, lost a wife and a child we never got to meet. If I believed in curses, I'd have given up years ago." His blue eyes held hers, earnest and steady. "I'm not asking for anything beyond your company at a harvest dance, just a chance for you to step away from the shadow that's been cast over you here." Put that way, how could she refuse? "All right," she said finally. "I'll go with you to the dance." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I'll come for you at 4 on Saturday. It's a bit of a ride, but the weather should be fair." After he left, Cordelia stood in her garden for a long time, alternating between anticipation and anxiety. It had been so long since she'd attended any social function. Her wardrobe consisted almost entirely of somber, practical clothing suitable for a widow. The next day, she gathered her courage and visited Sarah's dressmaking shop. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and Sarah looked up from her work, surprise evident on her face. "Cordelia," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Once they had been as close as sisters. "Hello, Sarah." "I need a dress, something." She hesitated. "Something not black." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "You're out of mourning." "It's been nearly 2 months," Cordelia said, though she knew most widows wore black for at least a year. "And I've been invited to the harvest dance in Morgan Creek." "By Mason Wade, I suppose," Sarah said, a hint of disapproval in her voice. People are talking, you know. People have been talking about me for years, Cordelia replied evenly. I've stopped listening. Sarah sighed, setting aside the sewing she'd been working on. You're playing with fire, Cordy. Mason seems like a good man. Do you really want to risk what happened to the others? Nothing happened to my husbands because of me, Cordelia said, her patience wearing thin. James caught fever. Henry died in an accident that killed 5 other men. Thomas got himself shot in a card game I wasn't even present for. But the pattern is coincidence, not curse, Cordelia interrupted firmly. Now, will you make me a dress or not? We used to be friends, Sarah. Something in Sarah's expression softened. We still are. I've just been worried for you, and yes, for Mason too. She moved to a shelf of fabrics. I have a lovely blue cotton that would suit your coloring. I could have it ready by Friday. Relief flooded through Cordelia. Thank you. As Sarah measured her, some of their old companionable rapport returned. Sarah shared town gossip that had nothing to do with curses or widows, and Cordelia found herself laughing for what felt like the first time in years. He seems to care for you, Sarah said, as Cordelia prepared to leave. Mason, I mean. We're friends, Cordelia said carefully. Sarah gave her a knowing look. If you say so. She hesitated, then added, for what it's worth, I hope things work out for you this time. You deserve some happiness, Cordy. The unexpected support brought tears to Cordelia's eyes. Thank you, Sarah. That means more than you know. Saturday arrived clear and cool, perfect weather for the harvest dance. Cordelia spent extra time on her appearance, pinning her honey-brown hair in a style more elaborate than her usual practical bun. The new dress fit perfectly, the blue fabric bringing out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. When Mason arrived, his appreciative gaze made her cheeks warm. You look beautiful, he said simply. Thank you. She gestured to her dress. It felt like time for a change. He helped her mount the gentle mare he'd brought for her, and they set off for Morgan Creek. The ride was pleasant, with conversation flowing easily between them. Cordelia found herself relaxing, enjoying the crisp autumn air and Mason's company. Tell me about this dance, she said as they rode. Do you know many people in Morgan Creek? Some, he replied. I do business with a few ranchers there. It's a friendly little town smaller than Clearwater Gulch. The harvest dance is their big social event of the fall. Cordelia nodded, trying to quell the butterflies in her stomach. It had been so long since she'd been to any social gathering where she wasn't viewed with suspicion or pity. Morgan Creek turned out to be charming, a cluster of buildings around a central square, which had been transformed for the dance with lanterns, hay bales for seating, and a raised platform where 3 musicians were setting up. Mason helped her dismount, then offered his arm. Ready. Taking a deep breath, Cordelia nodded and placed her hand on his arm. Together, they joined the gathering crowd. True to Mason's word, the people of Morgan Creek welcomed them warmly. He introduced her simply as Miss Cordelia Bennett, a friend from Clearwater Gulch, with no mention of her status as a widow. No one seemed to recognize her name or connect her to any rumors. For the first time in years, Cordelia found herself simply being treated as a normal woman attending a dance with a handsome man. The relief was so profound it made her lightheaded. When the music started, Mason held out his hand. May I have this dance, Miss Bennett? She hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. You may, Mr. Wade. He led her confidently through a lively reel, his hand warm and steady at her waist. Cordelia was surprised to find that her body remembered the steps, though it had been years since she danced. They moved together with unexpected grace, and when the song ended, Mason's eyes held a spark of delight that matched the feeling blossoming in her own chest. They danced again and again as the evening progressed. During a break for refreshments, Mason introduced her to several of his acquaintances, ranchers and their wives who treated her with easy friendliness. Your first time in Morgan Creek? Asked Mrs. Henderson, a plump, cheerful woman married to one of the local cattle buyers. Yes, Cordelia admitted. It's lovely, so festive. We do love our harvest dance, Mrs. Henderson agreed. Though I'm surprised we haven't seen you before. Mason usually comes alone. She gave Mason a teasing look. He's been one of our most sought-after bachelors for years. Cordelia glanced at Mason, who looked uncharacteristically uncomfortable. Has he now? Oh, yes, Mrs. Henderson continued, oblivious to Mason's discomfort. Half the unmarried ladies in the county have set their caps for him, but he's never seemed interested. Until now, it seems. She winked broadly. Before the conversation could become more awkward, the musicians struck up another tune, and Mason quickly asked Cordelia to dance again. This time it was a waltz, slower and more intimate than the earlier reels. I apologize for Mrs. Henderson, he said as they moved across the square. She means well but has no sense of propriety. There's no need to apologize, Cordelia assured him. It was actually rather nice to be the object of friendly gossip for a change, instead of fearful whispers. Mason's arm tightened slightly around her waist. You deserve far better than what Clearwater Gulch has given you. Something in his tone made her look up, and what she saw in his eyes took her breath away. It wasn't pity or friendly concern, it was something deeper, warmer, more intense. Mason, she began, not sure what she wanted to say. You don't have to say anything, he said softly. Just dance with me, Cordelia. And so she did, allowing herself to be drawn closer into his embrace as they waltzed beneath the stars and lantern light. For those few precious minutes, the past with all its sorrows seemed to fall away, leaving only the present moment, the music, the cool night air, and the secure circle of Mason's arms. The harvest dance became a turning point. In the weeks that followed, Mason's visits to Cordelia's home grew more frequent and less disguised as casual stops. The people of Clearwater Gulch watched with a mixture of fascination and dread as Mason Wade openly courted the woman they still called cursed. Some tried to warn him. Sheriff Donovan pulled Mason aside one day as he was leaving the general store. Wade, a word, the lawman said gruffly. You're a respected man in these parts. Got a good head on your shoulders, so I can't figure why you're tangling with the Bennett widow. Mason's expression remained neutral. Mrs. Bennett is a friend of mine, Sheriff. I don't see how that's anyone's business but ours. Friend, Donovan scoffed. The whole town knows you're sweet on her, and the whole town knows what happens to men who get close to that woman. Mason's jaw tightened. What happens, Sheriff, is that people die in a dangerous country. Same as anywhere else out here. 3 husbands, Wade, all dead before their time. And not a single one of those deaths had anything to do with Cordelia, Mason replied, his patience wearing thin. James Bennett died of the same fever that took 12 others that winter. Henry Foster died with 5 other miners when a shaft collapsed, and Thomas Bennett was shot in a saloon brawl over cards. The sheriff shook his head. You can explain away each one, sure, but 3. That's more than coincidence. No, Mason said firmly. It's exactly coincidence, and I'd appreciate it if you and the rest of the town would stop treating a grieving widow like she's some kind of witch. With that, he tipped his hat coldly to the sheriff and continued on his way to Cordelia's house. She was in her garden when he arrived, harvesting the last of her herbs before the first frost. The sight of her, serene and focused on her task, eased the tension that had built up during his encounter with Donovan. Those look healthy, he commented, nodding toward the herbs she was gathering. Cordelia looked up, her face brightening at the sight of him. Mason. I wasn't expecting you today. I had some business in town, he said, not mentioning his confrontation with the sheriff. Thought I'd stop by to see if you needed anything. She rose, brushing dirt from her hands. Just your company, come in for coffee. Inside her small house, Mason noticed new touches that hadn't been there before: a vase of late blooming wildflowers on the table, a colorful quilt draped over the back of a chair, a shelf of books that had previously been packed away. Cordelia's home was coming back to life, just as she was. As she prepared coffee, Mason wandered to the bookshelf, examining the titles. You have quite a collection, he observed. Books were my escape as a child, she explained, bringing 2 steaming cups to the table. My father encouraged it. He was a school teacher back in Ohio before we came west. Mason sat across from her, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. Cordelia, there's something I'd like to discuss with you. Her expression grew cautious. That sounds serious. It is, in a way. He took a breath. Winter's coming on. My nearest neighbor is 3 miles away, and the ranch can get isolated when the snow is heavy. I imagine so, she said, not sure where he was going with this. I'd like to hire someone to help around the house during the winter months. Someone who could keep things organized, maybe do some cooking. He paused. I thought of you. Cordelia stared at him. You want me to work for you, as a housekeeper? A faint flush colored Mason's cheeks. Not exactly. I mean, yes, I need help with the house, but... He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking boyishly uncertain. The truth is, I'm looking for a reason to have you at the ranch that would be acceptable to people's sensibilities. Understanding dawned. You want me to stay at your ranch this winter. I want you in my life, he said simply. Every day, not just when I can find an excuse to ride into town. His blue eyes held her steadily. I care for you, Cordelia, more than I expected to care for anyone again after Caroline died. Her heart raced. Mason, I care for you too. But you know what people say. The risk is one I'm willing to take, he interrupted firmly. I told you before, I don't believe in curses. I believe in living while we can, in grabbing happiness when it's offered. Tears welled in Cordelia's eyes. And if something happened to you? If the pattern continued? I couldn't bear it, Mason. Not again. He reached across the table and took her hand. Nothing is going to happen to me, and even if it did someday, because yes, life out here is dangerous, it wouldn't be because of any curse. It would just be life, Cordelia. The same risk everyone takes by waking up each morning. His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. I'm not asking you to marry me. Not yet. I'm just asking for a chance to build something between us without the whole town watching and waiting for disaster. Cordelia looked down at their joined hands. The prospect of leaving Clearwater Gulch, even temporarily, was both terrifying and liberating. And the thought of spending the winter at Mason's ranch, seeing him every day, learning the rhythms of his life. I'll need to think about it, she said finally. Mason nodded, disappointment flickering briefly in his eyes before he masked it. Of course, take all the time you need. But as he rose to leave, Cordelia realized she didn't need more time. The answer was already clear in her heart. Mason, wait. She stood, moving around the table to face him. I don't need to think about it. The answer is yes. His face lit up with such joy that it nearly took her breath away. You're sure? In answer, Cordelia did something she hadn't planned. She rose on tiptoe and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. I'm sure. Mason's hand came up to cup her face, his calloused palm gentle against her skin. For a moment they stood that way, eyes locked, hovering on the edge of something new and precious. I should go, he said reluctantly. Lots to prepare if you're coming to the ranch. When should I be ready? She asked. Is next week too soon? Cordelia smiled. Not soon enough. The news that Cordelia Bennett was leaving Clearwater Gulch to work at Mason Wade's ranch spread through town like wildfire. Some expressed relief that the cursed widow would no longer be in their midst. Others worried for Mason, convinced he was sealing his own fate by bringing her into his home. Sarah was one of the few who reacted with genuine concern for Cordelia herself. Are you sure about this? She asked when Cordelia came to the dress shop to order a few practical work dresses for ranch life. Living alone with a man, even as his employee, people will talk. People have been talking about me for years, Cordelia reminded her. At least this time, the gossip will be about something I've chosen for myself. Sarah studied her friend's face. You love him, don't you? The directness of the question caught Cordelia off guard. I care for him deeply, she admitted. Whether that's love yet, I'm not sure, but I want the chance to find out. Sarah squeezed her hand. Then go with my blessing, and write to me. I want to know everything. The day of Cordelia's departure dawned clear and cold. She had packed her few belongings into 2 trunks, sold or stored the furniture she couldn't take, and arranged to rent her house to the new telegraph operator who had recently arrived in town. Mason arrived with his wagon mid-morning. As he loaded her trunks, Cordelia took a last look around the small house that had been the setting for so much of her life's sorrow. Strangely, she felt no regret at leaving it behind, only a cautious optimism about what lay ahead. The journey to the Double W took most of the day. By the time they arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. Cordelia was struck again by the peaceful beauty of the place, the sturdy main house with smoke curling from its chimney, the well-maintained barns and corrals, the distant mountains framing it all. "Welcome home," Mason said softly as he helped her down from the wagon. Mrs. Patterson, the foreman's wife who had been keeping house for Mason, greeted them at the door. She was a practical-looking woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Got everything ready for you, Miss Bennett," she said. "The east bedroom's all made up, nice morning light in there, dinner's on the stove. I'll be back day after tomorrow to help you get settled with the household routines." "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson," Cordelia said, warming to the woman's matter-of-fact acceptance. After the older woman left, Mason showed Cordelia to her room, spacious and comfortable, with a large window overlooking the eastern pastures where his cattle grazed. A small vase of late-season wildflowers sat on the dresser. "Mrs. Patterson's touch?" Cordelia asked, gesturing to the flowers. Mason shook his head, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Mine, actually, wanted you to feel welcome." The simple gesture touched her deeply. "Thank you, Mason." He left her to settle in while he brought in her trunks and saw to the horses. Cordelia unpacked her clothing into the cedar-scented dresser drawers, arranged her few personal items on the bedside table, and placed her books on the small shelf by the window. By the time Mason knocked on her door to announce that dinner was ready, she was feeling more at home than she had in years. The next few weeks established a comfortable routine. Cordelia took over the household duties, cooking and cleaning with an efficiency that impressed even Mrs. Patterson. She learned the rhythms of ranch life: early mornings, hard work, the satisfaction of seeing immediate results from one's efforts. More importantly, she and Mason grew closer each day. Their conversations over meals ranged from practical matters of running the ranch to deeper discussions of books, dreams, and memories. In the evenings, they often sat before the fire, sometimes reading quietly, sometimes talking long into the night. As November turned to December, and the first heavy snows blanketed the land, Cordelia found herself more content than she could remember being since before James died. The isolation that winter brought to the ranch didn't feel confining, it felt like a protective blanket, giving her and Mason space to know each other away from prying eyes and whispered fears. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Mason set aside the ledger he'd been reviewing and looked at her thoughtfully. "Christmas is coming," he said. "First one in years I haven't spent alone." Cordelia looked up from her mending. "Will we go into town for services?" "If the weather allows. If not, we could have our own celebration here." He hesitated. "Either way, I'd like to get you a gift, something special." "You don't need to get me anything," she protested. "You've already given me so much a place here, a new start." Mason's eyes were soft in the firelight. "Humor me. Is there anything you've been wanting?" Cordelia considered. "There is one thing, but it's not something you can wrap up with a bow." "What is it?" She set aside her sewing. "I'd like to learn to ride properly. Not just sitting a gentle mare for short distances, but really riding." Mason's face lit up. "That's something I can definitely give you. We'll start tomorrow, weather permitting." And so began a new element to their daily routine. Each afternoon, when the ranch work allowed, Mason would take Cordelia to the corral and patiently teach her to ride. He started her on Daisy, the gentle mare she was already familiar with, but soon had her trying other horses as her confidence grew. Cordelia proved to be a natural horsewoman once she overcame her initial nervousness. The freedom of riding across the snow-covered pastures, wind in her hair and color in her cheeks, awakened something in her that had long been dormant, a sense of joy and possibility. Mason watched her transformation with barely concealed delight. The reserved, cautious widow was giving way to a vibrant, laughing woman who tackled each new challenge with determination and spirit. One crisp December afternoon, they rode further than usual, to a ridge overlooking the entire ranch. The vista was breathtaking, miles of snow-covered land stretching to the distant mountains, the buildings of the Double W looking like a child's toys from this height. "It's beautiful," Cordelia breathed, her breath fogging in the cold air. Mason, sitting astride his horse beside her, nodded. "First time I saw this view, I knew this was where I wanted to build my life." He glanced at her. Caroline loved it too. It was the first time he'd mentioned his late wife in weeks. Cordelia turned to him. "Tell me about her. What was she like?" A gentle smile touched his lips. "She was brave. Came west with nothing but faith that we could make something good here. She was practical too, could make a meal from almost nothing, patch clothes, until there was more patch than original fabric." His expression grew tender. "She loved books, like you, had a laugh that could light up a room." "You must miss her very much," Cordelia said softly. "I do," he acknowledged. "Always will. But—" He turned to look directly at Cordelia. "The heart has an amazing capacity to heal, to make room for new love without diminishing what came before." The word love hung in the air between them. Neither had used it before to describe what was growing between them. "I know something about that," Cordelia said finally. "James will always be part of me. He was my first love, so young and full of hope." She smiled sadly. "Henry and Thomas were different. I cared for them, respected them, but what I felt wasn't love. Not really." She looked out over the snow-covered landscape. "I think that's partly why the town's gossip hurts so much, not just because they called me cursed, but because they assumed I'd lost the love of my life 3 times over. In truth, I'd only lost it once." "And now?" Mason asked, his voice low. Cordelia turned to him, her heart in her eyes. "Now I find myself feeling things I thought were gone forever, hoping for things I'd convinced myself I didn't deserve." Mason reached across the space between their horses and took her gloved hand in his. "You deserve everything good in this world, Cordelia Bennett, and if you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life trying to give it to you." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to her eyes. "Even knowing what people say, that I'm cursed, that loving me might be dangerous, especially knowing that," he said firmly, "because it's nonsense and I aim to prove it." He urged his horse closer until their knees were touching. Then, with exquisite gentleness, he leaned over and kissed her. His lips were warm despite the cold air, and Cordelia felt herself responding with a hunger that surprised her. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "I love you, Cordelia," Mason said simply. "Have for months now. Probably since that day in the rain when you put your hand in mine and trusted me to see you home." "I love you too," she whispered, the words both terrifying and liberating. "God help me, I do." Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, the sun turning the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling expanse of white. Cordelia woke early, excitement fluttering in her chest like a child's. So much had changed in the weeks since she'd come to the Double W, most of all herself. She dressed in her best dress, the blue one Sarah had made for the harvest dance, and pinned her hair carefully. From her drawer, she took out the small package she'd prepared for Mason, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a bit of red ribbon she'd saved. When she entered the main room, she found Mason already up, stoking the fire to chase away the morning chill. He turned at her entrance, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "Merry Christmas," he said, crossing to her and placing a gentle kiss on her lips. Such gestures had become natural between them since that day on the ridge, each one still thrilling in its newness. "Merry Christmas," she returned, holding out her package. "It isn't much, but—" Mason took it carefully, as if it were made of glass. "You didn't have to get me anything." "Neither did you, but I suspect you did anyway," she teased, nodding toward a larger package that sat beneath the small pine tree they had cut and decorated together. He grinned, caught out. "Open yours first." The package was heavy for its size. Cordelia unwrapped it carefully to find a leather-bound book, a journal, the cover tooled with an intricate design of wildflowers. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the detailed work. "I had it made special by a leatherworker in Denver," Mason explained. "Had to send for it weeks ago. I thought you might want to write your own stories instead of just reading others." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. "I love it, Mason, thank you." "Now mine," he said, carefully unwrapping her gift. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool, along with a small framed sketch she had done of his favorite horse, Thunder. "Cordelia, these are wonderful," he said, wrapping the scarf around his neck immediately. "I didn't know you could draw like this." She smiled shyly. "I used to draw all the time as a girl. Hadn't done it in years until I came here. Something about this place made me want to try again." "It's excellent," he said, examining the sketch closely. "You've captured Thunder perfectly." They spent the morning exchanging small gifts with the ranch hands who hadn't gone to town for the holiday, then enjoyed a special Christmas dinner that Cordelia had been preparing for days. As evening fell, they sat before the fire, content in each other's company. Mason had been unusually quiet for the past hour, and Cordelia sensed there was something on his mind. "Is everything all right?" she asked finally. He turned to her, his expression serious. "There's one more gift I'd like to give you, if you'll accept it." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. Cordelia's breath caught in her throat as he opened it to reveal a simple but elegant gold ring set with a small pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained softly. "Cordelia Bennett, these past months have been the happiest I've known in years. I love you more than I thought possible, and I want to build a life with you right here, if you're willing." Tears filled her eyes as he continued. "I know people will talk. I know they'll say you're cursed and that I'm tempting fate, but I don't care." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "All I care about is waking up beside you every morning and falling asleep with you every night for whatever years we're given." He took her hand. "Will you marry me, Cordelia? Will you be my wife, my partner, my heart?" For a moment, fear clutched at her, the old, familiar fear that loving her was dangerous, that she would somehow bring harm to this man she had come to cherish. But then she looked into Mason's eyes and saw nothing but steadfast love and unwavering belief in their future together. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Mason, I will marry you." With hands that trembled slightly, he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her all along. Their kiss was both tender and passionate, a promise of all that lay ahead. When they finally drew apart, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "We'll have to decide when and where," he said. "I'd marry you tomorrow if we could find a preacher." Cordelia smiled. "I'd like a spring wedding, I think, when the land is coming back to life." She hesitated. "And I'd like it to be here, at the ranch. Not in town." Mason nodded, understanding her reluctance to make their wedding a public spectacle in Clearwater Gulch. "Spring it is, then, right here with just the people who matter to us." As they sat before the fire, making plans for their future, Cordelia felt the last of her fear melt away. Whatever came, good or bad, joy or sorrow, they would face it together. And in that certainty, she found a peace she had thought forever lost. News of their engagement spread quickly, despite the relative isolation of the ranch during the winter months. Mrs. Patterson carried the tidings to town, and soon letters began arriving, some congratulatory, some cautionary, all reflecting the town's continued fascination with Cordelia's story. Sarah wrote a warm note expressing her happiness for them both, along with an offer to make Cordelia's wedding dress. "It would be my honor," she wrote, "and high time someone in this town stood firmly on the side of love instead of superstition." Not all reactions were so positive. A letter arrived from Sheriff Donovan, addressed to Mason, bluntly stating that he was making a grave mistake and ignoring warnings any sensible man would heed. Mason tossed it into the fire without comment. The most surprising correspondence came from the preacher's wife, Mrs. Peterson, the same woman who had crossed the street to avoid Cordelia after Thomas's funeral. Her letter was stiff but sincere, acknowledging that perhaps the town had been too quick to judge and offering tentative good wishes for their future. As winter gave way to the first tentative signs of spring, Cordelia and Mason settled into the pleasant work of planning their life together. They decided on an April wedding, when the land would be green again and travel easier for the few guests they wished to invite. One crisp March morning, Mason announced that he needed to ride into Clearwater Gulch for supplies and to check on some business matters. "Would you like to come?" he asked. "Might be good to show your face in town before the wedding. Let people see you're thriving." Cordelia hesitated. She hadn't been to town since leaving in November, and the prospect was daunting. But Mason was right. Hiding away would only feed the gossip. "I'll come," she decided. "I should speak to Sarah about my dress anyway." The ride to town was pleasant, the air hinting at the warmth to come, though patches of snow still lingered in shaded areas. As they approached Clearwater Gulch, Cordelia felt her anxiety rising, but Mason's steady presence beside her gave her courage. The town looked unchanged, the same dusty Main Street, the same storefronts, the same curious eyes tracking their progress. But something was different, and it took Cordelia a moment to realize what it was. She was different. The woman who had left town 4 months ago, head bowed under the weight of whispers, had been replaced by someone stronger, more certain of her place in the world. They stopped first at the general store. "Mr. Harmon greeted them with professional courtesy, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of the engagement ring on Cordelia's finger, but making no comment. As Mason discussed an order of supplies with him, Cordelia browsed the shelves, conscious of the whispers from 2 women by the fabric display. "Marrying her despite everything. Brave man or a fool. A wager he won't last the year." Once, such words would have cut her to the quick. Now, Cordelia found she could hear them without flinching. Let them talk, she thought. Let them wait for a tragedy that would never come. After the general store, they separated briefly. Mason to see the banker about some business matters, Cordelia to visit Sarah's dress shop. Sarah welcomed her with genuine warmth, ushering her into the back room where they could talk privately. "You look wonderful," Sarah exclaimed, studying her friend's face. "Ranch life agrees with you." "It does," Cordelia agreed with a smile, "or perhaps it's just being with Mason." "Love becomes you," Sarah said simply. Then, leaning closer, "Is it very difficult being back in town?" "People are still talking, you know." "Let them," Cordelia replied with a serenity that surprised even her. "I've stopped listening." They spent a pleasant hour discussing designs for the wedding dress, with Sarah sketching ideas and showing fabric samples. By the time Mason came to collect her, Cordelia had settled on a design simple but elegant, with delicate embroidery rather than elaborate lace. "One more stop before we head back," Mason said as they left the dress shop. "I need to see Sheriff Donovan briefly." Cordelia tensed. The sheriff had been one of the most vocal about her supposed curse. "I'll wait out here." "No need," Mason said firmly. "You're going to be my wife. We face things together now." The sheriff's office was cool and dim after the bright spring sunshine. Donovan looked up from his desk, his expression souring slightly at the sight of them together. "Wade," he acknowledged. "Mrs. Bennett." "Miss Bennett," Mason corrected mildly. "We're here about the paperwork for that parcel of land adjoining the east border of my property." "You said you'd have it ready by now." Donovan shuffled through some papers on his desk. "Got it right here, just needs your signature." He slid a document across the desk, pointedly addressing only Mason. 400 acres, including water rights to the creek, price as agreed. As Mason reviewed the paperwork, the sheriff's gaze shifted to Cordelia. "Heard you two are getting hitched." "Next month," she confirmed, meeting his eyes steadily. Donovan shook his head slightly. "Bold move, Wade. Marrying the woman I love? Yes, I'd say so. Mason's tone was pleasant, but firm as he signed the document and slid it back across the desk. Anything else we need to discuss, Sheriff? Donovan seemed about to say something further, then thought better of it. No, that's all. As they left the office, Cordelia felt Mason's hand at the small of her back, a protective, possessive gesture that warmed her from within. You didn't tell me you were buying more land, she said as they walked toward their horses. Wanted it to be a surprise, he admitted. It's good grazing land, has a nice clearing that would be perfect for a new house someday. Thought our children might like to build there when they're grown. The casual mention of children, their children, sent a flood of emotion through Cordelia. For so long, she had suppressed any hope of having a family, convinced that her supposed curse made such dreams dangerous. You want children? She asked softly. Mason stopped walking and turned to face her, right there in the middle of the main street. I want everything with you, Cordelia. Children, grandchildren, a lifetime of building something that will outlast us both. His eyes held hers. If that's what you want too. It is, she whispered. More than anything. Heedless of the watching eyes from store windows and boardwalks, Mason bent and kissed her gently. Then that's what we'll have. As they rode out of town, Cordelia felt lighter than she had in years. The whispers and stares no longer had power over her. She was no longer the cursed widow of Clearwater Gulch. She was Cordelia Bennett, soon to be Cordelia Wade, a woman with a future as bright and open as the Colorado sky above them. April 18, 1876, dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for a wedding. Cordelia stood at the window of her room at the Double W, watching as the small group of guests arrived. There weren't many. Sarah and her husband, Mrs. Patterson and her family, a few of the neighboring ranchers and their wives, Mason's foreman and the ranch hands. No one from Clearwater Gulch except Sarah had accepted their invitation, but Cordelia found she didn't mind. Today was about new beginnings, not old wounds. Sarah helped her dress in the gown they had created together, ivory silk with delicate embroidery at the bodice and hem, simple but elegant. Her honey brown hair was arranged in soft curls, adorned with small white flowers from the first blooms of spring. You look beautiful, Sarah said, adjusting the small wreath of flowers. Mason won't know what hit him, Cordelia smiled, surprisingly calm despite the magnitude of the day. Thank you, Sarah, not just for the dress or for helping me today, for believing in me when almost no one else did. Sarah squeezed her hand. I'm sorry I ever doubted, even for a moment. A knock at the door announced that it was time. The ranch hands had constructed a simple arbor in the yard, decorated with early spring wildflowers. Mason waited there with the circuit preacher, who had ridden 3 days to perform the ceremony. As Cordelia stepped out of the house onto the porch, a hush fell over the small gathering. She paused, taking in the scene: the flower-decked arbor, the smiling faces of their few friends, and Mason, standing tall and handsome in his best suit, looking at her as if she were the sunrise after the longest night. With steady steps, she walked toward him, her heart full of a joy she had thought forever lost to her. When she reached him, Mason took her hands in his blue eyes shining with love and certainty. You're sure? He whispered, low enough that only she could hear. Last chance to escape the wild notion of marrying a stubborn rancher. Cordelia's smile was radiant. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They exchanged the traditional vows, their voices clear and unwavering. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Mason kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. The celebration afterward was joyful, a feast prepared by Mrs. Patterson and the ranch cook, music provided by one of the hands who played a fiddle, dancing in the yard as the afternoon sun warmed the air. As evening approached, their guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds alone. Mason led Cordelia to the ridge where he had proposed, now transformed by spring's touch from a snow-covered expanse to a green vista dotted with wildflowers. Happy, Mrs. Wade? he asked, his arm around her waist. Happier than I ever thought possible, she admitted, leaning into his embrace. And a little afraid. Of what? She turned in his arms to face him. Of how much I love you, of how much I have to lose now. Understanding softened his features. That's not fear, my love. That's just life. The price we pay for loving deeply is knowing that someday, one way or another, we'll have to say goodbye. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. But until then, we have today, and tomorrow, and all the days we're given. When did you get so wise? She asked, a teasing note entering her voice. Must be the company I keep, he replied, drawing her closer. I have a wise, beautiful wife now, you know. Do you indeed? MMM, and I intend to love her thoroughly for the next 50 years or so. Only 50, she murmured against his lips. At least, he promised, sealing the vow with a kiss that spoke of all the tomorrows stretching before them. Epilogue, 10 years later, Mama, Jamie pulled my hair again. Cordelia Wade looked up from the garden, where she was harvesting late summer vegetables, to see her 8-year-old daughter, Caroline, storming across the yard, her younger brother trailing behind with a guilty expression. James Thomas Wade, Cordelia called, trying to sound stern despite the smile tugging at her lips. What have we said about pulling your sister's hair? That it's not gentlemanly, the 6-year-old recited dutifully. But Ma, she said my drawing was stupid. Did not, Caroline protested. I just said horses don't look like that. Children, Cordelia intervened, setting down her basket of tomatoes. Caroline, apologize for criticizing your brother's artwork. Jamie, apologize for pulling hair. Then both of you go wash up for dinner. Your father should be back soon. With the squabble temporarily resolved and the children scampering toward the house, Cordelia straightened, one hand at the small of her back. At 35, she was still slender, though the births of 3 children had softened her figure. A few strands of silver had begun to appear in her honey-brown hair, but her eyes were bright with contentment. The sound of approaching horses made her look up. Mason was riding in from the north pasture, accompanied by their oldest child, 10-year-old Matthew. The boy sat tall in the saddle, the image of his father with the same dark hair and blue eyes. Cordelia's heart swelled at the sight of them. 10 years of marriage had only deepened her love for Mason. They had built a good life together, expanded the ranch, raised their children, created a home filled with love and laughter. Not that there hadn't been challenges. The first 2 years of their marriage, the whispers from town had continued, with some still waiting for tragedy to strike. But as time passed, and Mason remained hale and hearty, the talk of curses gradually faded. Eventually, even the most superstitious had to admit that perhaps Cordelia Bennett's string of widowhood had been nothing more than terrible luck. Now, they were respected members of the community. Mason served on the territorial council, and Cordelia had started a small school on the ranch for their children and those of neighboring families. The cursed widow of Clearwater Gulch was a fading memory, replaced by Mrs. Wade, the capable rancher's wife known for her hospitality and quiet strength. Mason dismounted with the easy grace that still made her heart skip, then helped Matthew down. He said something to the boy that made him laugh before sending him toward the house. Then he turned toward Cordelia, his smile warming as their eyes met across the yard. "There's my beautiful wife," he called, striding toward her. "Flatterer," she returned, but she went willingly into his embrace when he reached her. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his hand moving to rest protectively over the slight swell of her belly, just beginning to show beneath her apron. Well enough. The morning sickness is finally easing. This 4th pregnancy had been unexpected. They had thought their family complete with 3 children. But the new life growing within her felt like another blessing, another affirmation of all they had built together. Mason kissed her forehead. "You should rest more." "I'm perfectly fine," she assured him. "Just finishing the gardening before dinner. The children are washing up." "And I should too." He glanced down at his dusty clothes. "Give me 10 minutes." As he headed for the house, Cordelia gathered her basket of vegetables and followed more slowly, pausing on the porch to look out over the ranch that had become her home and sanctuary. In the distance, she could see the small fenced plot where 3 grave markers stood, simple wooden crosses for her former husbands, moved here from the Clearwater Gulch Cemetery in a gesture of respect that had been Mason's idea. "They were part of your journey to me," he had said. "They deserve a place here." Beside them stood a 4th marker, this one for a baby girl who had lived only 2 days, their second child, born too early during a harsh winter storm. That loss had nearly broken Cordelia, stirring all the old fears about curses and fate. But Mason had held her through the darkest nights, his faith in their future never wavering. "We'll try again when you're ready," he had promised, "and she'll always be part of us." They had named the baby Sarah, and the following spring, Caroline had been born, healthy and strong. Now, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Cordelia offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the life she had found, for the love that had healed her, for the family that had grown around her, for the man who had taken her hand when others pulled away in fear. Inside the house, she could hear the happy chaos of her family, Matthew and Caroline, bickering good-naturedly over whose turn it was to set the table. Jamie chattering to his father about the frog he'd caught that morning, Mason's deep laugh in response. With a contented smile, Cordelia went inside to join them, closing the door on the gathering dusk. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, but tonight, surrounded by the family she and Mason had created together, she was exactly where she was meant to be, not cursed, but blessed beyond measure.